reverse-seared ribeye. It's the three words that defined a great steak for a whole generation of cooks, including me. About 20 years ago, a young and talented food writer wrote about it in Cooks Illustrated. It was Kenji Lopez-Alt. You might have heard of him. No need to tell me that Kenji didn't invent this method. That's like saying that Prometheus did not invent the fire. So what? He was the one who brought it to us, mere mortals. Thanks to that article, the quality of our collective steaks has improved tenfold. So, it's with a bit of trepidation that I want to offer some amendments to this method. Every time that I disagree with the cooks that I love and respect, people leave me comments saying that I threw Samin under the bus or Adam under the bus. I think that's ridiculous. There are a gazillion people making pasta badly on the internet. Are they worth disagreeing with? Of course not. Samin is actually worth disagreeing with because her pasta is amazing. What I sometimes disagree with is the way someone's methodology is communicated. It's not being mean, it's called having a healthy discussion. The day Kenji or Adam or Samin find any of my videos worthy of public disagreement, I'll open a bottle of champagne because that's when I'll feel I've really made it. Okay, reverse sear. I've used this method for almost 20 years and I've noticed that the results weren't always consistent. Sometimes the steak was done more and sometimes less, and even when I nailed the doneness to a perfect 130 Fahrenheit, sometimes the steak was delightful and sometimes a little tough. So I decided to untangle how much of it is the technique and how much is the quality of the meat. To do that, I bought an unreasonable amount of ribeye and tested all the hypotheses that were bugging me for years. If you are not familiar with reverse sear, you can check out my video on why and how it works, or read Kenji's article on searreceipts.com. As always, I'm not going to jump to the results. To understand what the results mean, you first have to understand how the testing was done, the possible errors and limitations of this testing. All the steaks in the experiment were ribeyes. Most were prime and bought at the same store, with the exception of one, which was a local 100% grass-fed ribeye. Most steaks were boneless and a couple were bone-in. I wanted to test steaks of different thickness, and some thicknesses only came with the bone and some only came without the bone. All the steak thicknesses were measured accurately with a ruler. Nothing was eyeballed. I've even gone as far as to level out the steaks that were cut too crooked at the store. The thermometer was always inserted sideways and moved around enough to find the minimum temperature. This is a big deal. For some reason, I've noticed that in many Sear Seeds articles, Kenji inserts his thermometer diagonally from the top. When I tried that, I noticed that it's very easy to miss the minimum temperature. In other words, if the very center is 100, you might be getting a reading of 110 or even 120. All the steaks for this experiment were cooked at 250 Fahrenheit on a rack. I didn't want to be biased by one steak being better seasoned than another, so I weighed the steaks and used 1% of salt for all the steaks. Keep in mind that no two ribeyes are alike. The rib section lives between the chuck and the loin. The part closest to the loin is called the small end. It will have a big eye and no flap. The closer we get to the large end, that's the part closer to the chuck, the smaller the eye gets and the larger the flap gets. Once we are all the way at the large end, the ribeye is about half eye and half flap. All else being equal, The small end is tougher than the large end. So some of the textural differences that I've observed could be due to the individual differences between the steaks. Also keep in mind that doneness is not the color of the meat, it's the temperature of the meat. None of the steaks in the video will look red and bloody because of the studio lights I'm using. I could certainly get them to look good to you by manipulating the footage in post-production or simply by letting the steak sit and oxidize after slicing. The longer the cut side is exposed to air, the redder it gets. But I didn't want to do that because I wanted to taste all the steaks at the correct temperature. I also didn't want to judge the steaks by the flap. When food writers want to show you an appetizing picture of a ribeye, they always cut into the flap. It's much redder than the eye, so it makes for a great picture. It's also exceptionally tasty. It's my favorite part of the cow. But there's not that much of it, and some ribeyes don't have it at all. So all my taste tests were comparing a bite from the middle of the eye. The elephant in the room with reverse-sear is the thickness of the steak. It makes a huge difference to the final doneness. Most reverse-sear write-ups give you only one temperature for each doneness. For example, in Kenji's write-up, he gives you temperatures for different donesses, but there is only one medium rare temperature out of the oven, and only one thickness of the steak, 1.5 inches. Do you have any idea how hard it is to buy a steak that's exactly that thickness? At my store, the thicknesses are all over the place, anywhere from 1 inch to 2 inches. On some days, there is not a single 1.5 inch ribeye. In Kenji's original write-up in Cooks Illustrated, I believe he called for pulling the steak out of the oven at 95 Fahrenheit for medium rare. This works great for a steak that's 1.25 inches thick. If we change the thickness by as little as 1/4 inch, that temperature no longer works. So I decided to test all different thicknesses of steak to figure out once and for all what the temperature should be out of the oven to end up at 130 Fahrenheit after sear and rest. And here are the results. For 1.5 inch steak, I needed 100 Fahrenheit. For 1.75 inch steak, I needed 110. And for 2 inch thick steak, I needed 115. I also learned that I suck at eyeballing. Steaks come in all different shapes, so from now on, I'm using a ruler. I was hoping that I can come up with some magic formula that would work for all steak thicknesses. Maybe we could cook all steaks to 115 in the oven, let them rest until the internal temperature starts to go down, and then sear them. Unfortunately, it didn't work. I tried it on a 2 inch thick steak and a 1.5 inch thick steak, and here's what happened. When I pulled a 2 inch thick steak out of the oven at 115, it stayed hot inside for a long time and went up to 122. 25 minutes after I got it out of the oven, it came back down to 120, and that's when I seared it. Since the outside of the steak cooled off significantly by that time, it never got above 124 after rest, although the very center never quite hit 130. On a steak that thick, most of the meat did, and the final result tasted tender and juicy. But when I tried this concept on a steak that was 1.5 inches thick, it didn't go as well. I got it to 115 in the oven. During rest, it went up to 117, but in just 10 minutes, it started to go down and dropped to 112. After sear, it was almost 140, so I cut into it after resting it for only 2 minutes, and the steak tasted overcooked to me. Not terrible, but definitely less than ideal. I know in the video the color difference isn't huge, but the textural difference was significant. So unfortunately, I don't think there is one temperature that works for all thicknesses. I don't normally pre-salt steak for reverse sear, but many cooks, including Kenji, recommend it, and I wanted to try it. Even seasoning is not the only reason for pre-salting. Another reason is that doing it on a rack overnight, uncovered, results in a steak that is so exceptionally dry on the outside that it sears faster and better. At least that's the theory. I tried this out with 2 ribeyes of identical thickness. One was salted on a rack overnight and the other one was salted right before cooking. The steak that was salted overnight was definitely drier on the outside. I can't say it browned better, though that could be due to the fact that it was a less fatty ribeye. Here are the stats on these 2 steaks. Given the same duration of browning, it did develop much more of a dry, gray outside than the steak that was salted right before cooking. Here's the one that was pre-salted and dried overnight. And here's the one that was salted right before cooking. I don't know if you've noticed, but the 2-inch thick steak from the previous experiment had a slightly gray ring around the outside too, and it was salted and dried overnight as well. Okay, so let's not jump to conclusions here. I'm not saying that pre-salting on an uncovered rack is bad. I'm all for drying meat with paper towels. You hear me say that in all the videos, but in this case, it felt like too much of a good thing. You can't just throw in the overnight drying on a rack without adjusting the sear duration and the temperature to which the steak is cooked in the oven to accommodate that shorter sear. With a steak this dry, you have to make your sear insanely brief, and I'm not sure it will be the kind of crust I personally like. I'm not big on charred steak. Here's the kind of browning I like, and I'm not sure if an over-dried steak would produce it. If you like your steak to be seasoned inside, but don't like it to be this dry, you can always salt it overnight wrapped up. In case you're wondering if drying it on a rack made it taste dry-aged, it didn't. One night in the fridge won't dry-age a steak. The sear is another variable that's difficult to control. We all have different burners and skillets. Some of us take 1 second to flip a steak and some take 10. Some take 1 second to set a timer and some take 10. So 45 seconds for one person could be 90 seconds for another person. Normally, I don't go by time, but by the color of the crust. But to be consistent for my experiments, I timed my sear to be 90 seconds per side for all steaks. This seemed fine for steaks that were not pre-salted overnight on a rack, but too long for the steaks that were. The original reverse-sear method published in Cooks Illustrated suggested resting the steak after sear. Kenji's more recent write-up in Series C suggested that you don't have to. Given the surprisingly high temperature that he suggests before sear, I can see that you don't want to allow for any carryover cooking. When cooking a 1.5-inch steak, I bring it to 100 Fahrenheit in the oven and Kenji brings it to 115. Sure, my sear is 90 seconds per side and Kenji's is 45, but even with a 45-second sear, a 115 steak will get to at least 140 if you let it rest. So, for Kenji's procedure, the rest is not optional, it's undesirable. But I have a bit of a problem with this idea of no rest. Rest and thus residual heat is not something you can easily stop. If you want to serve your steak whole, you're out of luck. Unless you can gobble it up in 1 minute, it will continue to go up in temperature. If you choose to slice it immediately, you can certainly reduce residual heat. But you're leaving yourself no room for error. What if 45 seconds wasn't quite enough to brown the steak to your liking? What if you were cooking 3 steaks and by the time you got to slicing the 3rd one, it cooked more than you wanted? I prefer to leave myself ample room for browning and resting. Here's how I deal with undercooking. If I don't get to 120 after the first 5 minutes of rest, I put the plate with the steak back in the oven and rest it there until it reaches 130. Keep in mind that you can always cook the steak more, but you can't uncook it. When I tell my students in class that I expect the steak to rest for 10 to 15 minutes, they are always concerned about it getting cold. I don't like a cold steak any more than you do. That's why the moment my steak comes out of the oven for the sear, I put a plate in the oven to warm up. It takes me 4 to 5 minutes to preheat the pan and to sear the steak. During this time, the plate will get warm and will prevent the outside temperature of the steak from dropping too fast. This warm plate is also necessary for the huge amount of carryover cooking that I get. If you put your steak on a cold plate, your temperature might not go up as much, but I really don't know why anyone would want to put a steak on a cold plate. Now let's talk about the meat quality. No matter how perfectly you nail the doneness, some ribeyes will be a little chewy. I used to think that USDA prime grade meant a certain level of tenderness, not just level of marbling. But turns out I was wrong. Prime simply means more marbling. You can have a well-marbled steak that's tender or a well-marbled steak that's tough. When I started cooking 20 years ago, prime beef was very hard to get. Only upscale butcher shops and restaurants carried it. When I first tried it, I thought it was significantly more tender than choice. But these days, most supermarkets in the Boston area carry prime. At some point in history, only the top 2% of American beef were graded prime. Today, as much as 3.5% of American beef is graded prime. The really good stuff goes to the restaurants and the expensive butchers, and the not so good stuff goes to the supermarkets. Out of curiosity, I threw in 1 steak into my experiments that was 100% grass-fed ribeye from a local farm. Grass-fed beef can never achieve the kind of marbling required for the prime grade. Grass-fed steaks that I tried from supermarkets were incredibly tough and dry in my opinion, but I was curious if the insanely priced grass-fed ribeye from a boutique butcher shop would make a convert out of me. Here are the stats on the steak. Given that it was the small end of the rib section, in other words, the eye only, no flap, it was very good. More tender than the equivalent prime ribeye from my local supermarket. But it wasn't as good as a supermarket prime ribeye from a large end, given the fact that it was twice the price. $45 per pound. I'm not sure that I'll be going back for more, but it's good to know that there is very good grass-fed beef out there for those who want to pay for it. I've seen many comments on Serious Eats and Reddit about prime ribeye tasting better at 135 Fahrenheit instead of 130. I actually agree, but there's a big but. When people are talking about 135, it's almost always in the context of sous-vide. And I found that sous-vide doneness is fundamentally different from reverse-seared doneness. When you're cooking in a water bath, the entire steak, from sea to shining sea, is that exact temperature. In the case of a prime ribeye, it helps for that temperature to be a little higher, like 135, so that all that intermuscular fat has a chance to melt. But when you're cooking a steak with the reverse-sear method, you have to realize that although the very center will only get to 130, there is a lot of muscle that will get to a slightly higher temperature, allowing most of the marbling to melt. Of course, it depends on the exact steak, so you can certainly experiment with cooking your prime steaks to a slightly higher temperature, but I still like it around 130. So, as Chef John says on his podcast, what did we learn today? 1. By the large end of the ribeye, you want the biggest flap possible and the smallest eye. This might make more of a difference to the texture of your steak than any other tips I'll give you. Measure your steak with a ruler, don't eyeball. Dry the steak well with paper towels and salt right before cooking. Bring it to the right temperature for your thickness in a 250-degree oven. Put the plate in the oven to warm up as soon as your steak comes out. Sear the steak until nicely brown, but don't exceed 90 seconds per side. Rest the steak on a warm plate and put a thermometer into it. Don't cut into the steak until the temperature stops rising and starts to go down. Unless, of course, you overcooked it, in which case, slice it really fast. Here are more thought-provoking culinary videos for you to check out, and if you are ever in the Boston area, maybe I'll see you in one of my classes.